Hello, so as a lot of you know, I recently finished reading The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath and I was struck by it for a multitude of reasons. One of those reasons being Plath's quite complex approach to lesbianism, which stayed with me after I had finished the book and left somewhat of a question mark above it. The more I thought about it, the more I knew I wanted to try and unpack it. I also wanted to make this video because upon researching the lesbianism in Plath's work, I found that a lot of people either wouldn't engage with the lesbian aspects of her work, or they would try and explain it away as something else altogether. This lesbian erasure surrounding Plath's work is very apparent in a lot of the research and reviews out there, and I wanted to really deconstruct the lesbianism in her work within the context of lesbian erasure. As a brief introduction to The Bell Jar, it's a semi-autobiographical novel first published in 1963 by Sylvia Plath under the pen name Victoria Lucas. The book follows the life of Esther Greene, a college student who is selected for a month-long summer internship as a guest editor at Ladies' Day magazine in New York City. However, she finds herself feeling disengaged, out of place, and unfulfilled. She then returns home to live with her mother, where her mental health further deteriorates and she ends up attempting suicide. However, she is rescued from this attempt and consequently institutionalized, and the reader basically follows this journey with her. As I mentioned, the subject of lesbianism does appear in The Bell Jar, and the purpose of today's video is to try and unpack it. Lesbianism has come up in Plath's work more than once, but The Bell Jar is really where it's at its most explicit. As a fun fact, Plath actually used to own a cat named Sappho, but I wasn't sure if that was just in relation to Virginia Woolf owning a cat named Sappho. I didn't know if there was some literary inspiration going on there, or of course Sylvia Plath was a poet, so it could have been to do with just poetry. However, in relation to this video, I thought it was a fun fact. Okay, so a couple of disclaimers before we really get into it. Firstly, nobody knows what Sylvia Plath's sexuality was. Only she can define that, and she's not here to do so. It's well documented that Ted Hughes actually destroyed parts of Sylvia Plath's journal and censored her work after her death, so anything that she may possibly have recorded in relation to queerness or lesbianism could possibly have been lost thanks to his destruction. That's not to say that there was definitely something there in relation to her sexuality in the first place, it's just that we'll now never know that for sure. Whatever the case, whilst she was alive, lesbianism was something that was very much threaded into and expressed in her work, and that is what we will be focusing on today. Secondly, we have to understand that the time period that Plath was alive in creating work, homosexuality was thought of as a medical disorder, and so both American and British societies were a lot more hostile and ignorant towards lesbianism than they are today. Plath definitely internalized these negative attitudes and projected them onto others, which is what makes this topic so complicated to deconstruct. I mean, we'll get to that, but the audience should be aware that we're really approaching lesbianism through the lens of a mid-20th century American society and not with today's generally more enlightened and educated views. Okay, so let's get into it. In The Bell Jar, the character of Esther Greene is primarily interested in pursuing men. However, it soon becomes obvious that this pursuit has various motivations which fall outside of romantic connection. A lot of the heteronormative pursuit in The Bell Jar is motivated by Esther losing her virginity for reasons which have nothing to do with a genuine sexual attraction to men. Esther has a very complex relationship with heterosexuality and is aware of the sexual disadvantage that women had in relation to the risks of pregnancy and the expectations of purity. She expresses resentment surrounding the disparity of heteronormative female sexuality in comparison to heteronormative male sexuality repeatedly, especially in relation to Buddy Willard, who she finds out has had a sexual affair before becoming involved with her. Esther says, "I couldn't stand the idea of a woman having to have a pure life and a man being able to have a double life, one pure and one not. And a man doesn't have a worry in the world while I've got a baby hanging over my head like a big stick to keep me in line." Esther is also very wary of heterosexual marriage and perceives it as a trap for women. She says, "And I knew that in spite of all the roses and kisses and restaurant dinners a man showered on a woman before he married her, what he secretly wanted when the wedding service ended was for her to flatten out underneath his feet, like Mrs. Willard's kitchen mat." Alongside the wariness of marriage and limitations on female sexuality, Esther also experiences a violent sexual assault, which she seems to internalise the trauma of. We don't get further insight into how this impacted her relationship with her own sexuality, but it is possible that experiencing a sexual assault would further complicate her attitude towards sex. Esther's approach to heteronormative sex and marriage seem more clinical than romantic, and in the novel, she approaches intimacy with men in a detached, almost intellectual manner. This is particularly observable with the figure of Erwin, who she loses her virginity to. She chooses Erwin because "I wanted somebody I didn't know and wouldn't go on knowing, a kind of impersonal priest-like official, as in the tales of tribal rites." Esther's sexual experience with Erwin is not only devoid of pleasure, but it causes her to hemorrhage. Still, Esther has some satisfaction from losing her virginity, expressing she feels part of a great tradition and no longer has the notion of purity hanging around her neck. The notion of compulsive heterosexuality is prominent in the Bell Jar, both through Esther's ignorance of homosexuality and, as Franziska We suggests in her work, female homosexuality in a heteronormative narrative, from the Bell Jar to Sex and the City, through seeking out men to try and define her own identity despite the lack of romance. We says, Esther is constantly second-guessing herself. For instance, in analysing why none of the boys she went on a date with invited her to a second one, quote, "I just didn't have any luck. After all, I wasn't crippled in any way. I just studied too hard. I didn't know when to stop." End quote. It is as since her dates with men do not lead to romance, surely there must be something wrong with her. Her dependence on men to define her own identity and femaleness also leads to Esther sleeping with Erwin. The incident certainly lacks the tenderness Dr. Nolan mentions when talking about what a woman could possibly see in a woman she does not see in a man. Not once does Esther find any tenderness, let alone a fulfilling romantic relationship, in any of the men she encounters. In fact, most of the men in her life have either left, her father, disappointed, Buddy Willard, or hurt her, Erwin. Still, she accepts the compulsory heterosexuality as a means for her to be a woman. Overall, Esther's interaction with heterosexuality in the Bell Jar has consistent themes of disengagement, disappointment, and in some cases, gore and violence. Esther is, however, aware that marriage and motherhood is expected of her rather than something she genuinely wants to engage in. Still, from the beginning to the end of the Bell Jar, it seems she cannot escape the stifling heteronormative expectations projected onto her, despite feeling disconnected from them. When faced with the subject of homosexuality, Esther appears to be ignorant and confused, stating that, "Whenever I thought about men and women, I could never really imagine what they would be actually doing. I wondered if all women did with other women was lie and hug." Esther then asks Dr. Nolan, her female psychiatrist, what does a woman see in a woman that she can't see in a man? Dr. Nolan responds to Esther by saying tenderness, and Esther reports to the reader, "That shut me up." Soon after this conversation with Dr. Nolan, Esther initiates herself into heterosexual experience with Erwin and discovers the exact opposite of tenderness. Ricky Werner suggests that Esther actually sought out the lying and hugging she attributed to lesbians in their work Queer Adolescence, Homosexuality in The Catcher in the Rye and The Bell Jar. Werner says, "When the opportunity to lose her virginity presents itself, when Esther's pseudo-boyfriend Buddy Willard lights some candles, uncorks a bottle of wine and proceeds to undress himself, Esther demurs. She feels very depressed until she and Buddy, quote, kissed and hugged a while, and I felt a little better, end quote. Both the lesbians lying and hugging, and Esther's kissing and hugging, are framed as benign or palliative alternatives to the heterosexual act. So, it could be suggested that when placing Esther's experience with heterosexuality alongside her own notion of lesbianism, the intimacy that Esther attributes to lesbianism is actually what she responds to, and perhaps this is why she sees her own double, the character of Joan Gilling, as a homosexual. Esther's first encounter with lesbianism in the bell jar is through the character of Joan Gilling. Esther and Joan grew up in the same town, went to the same church, dated the same boy, and, after both attempting suicide, they end up in the same mental institution. Shortly after being reunited with Joan, Esther makes it clear she isn't very fond of her. However, as the novel goes on, her relationship with Joan becomes much more layered, contradictory, and complex. For example, to begin with, it seems that both Esther and Joan are distant and judgmental towards each other. Esther notes Joan's initial treatment of her. She seemed perfectly at home among these women and treated me coolly, with a slight sneer, like a dim and inferior acquaintance. Esther also expresses her own contempt for Joan. Joan edged into the room and sat down on my bed. I wanted to tell her to get the hell out. She gave me the creeps. Only I couldn't do it. Following this, a lot of back and forth of quite strong emotions ensue between the pair. Joan makes it known to Esther that she has feelings for her, and Esther responds by telling her, "That's tough, Joan," I said, picking up my book, "because I don't like you. You make me puke if you want to know." And yet, afterwards, Esther tells the reader she finds Joan fascinating and that she treasures her. In spite of my profound reservations, I thought I would always treasure Joan. It was as if we had been forced together by some overwhelming circumstance, like war or plague, and shared a world of our own. And, in spite of the creepy feeling, and in spite of my old ingrained dislike, Joan fascinated me. It was like observing a Martian, or a particularly warty toad. Her thoughts were not my thoughts, nor her feelings my feelings, but we were close enough that her thoughts and feelings seemed a wry black image of my own. So, although Esther appears to be outwardly contemptuous of Joan, she describes her relation to her as though they are somehow intertwined, suggesting that Joan is a darker, mocking reflection of herself. A scene which stood out to me the most in terms of Esther and Joan's relationship is the scene where Joan and Dee Dee are sat at the piano together. Esther sees this and reacts quite bitterly. The reason this is relevant is because Esther catches Joan and Dee Dee in bed together later on, and looking at the wider picture, this earlier scene at the piano can be interpreted as Joan and Dee Dee developing an attractional relationship and Esther being jealous. The scene reads as such. Joan and Dee Dee were sitting side by side on the piano bench, and Dee Dee was teaching Joan to play the bottom half of chopsticks while she played the top. I thought how sad it was Joan looked so horsey, with such big teeth and eyes like two grey, goggly pebbles. Why, she couldn't even keep a boy like Buddy Willard. And Dee Dee's husband was obviously living with some mistress or other, turning her sour as an old fusty cat. So, after seeing them together, Esther goes on to attack both Joan and Dee Dee's appearance quite harshly, and says it's no wonder that Joan can't keep a boyfriend, and no wonder Dee Dee's husband has a mistress. Esther's reaction suggests she's feeling insecure, and interestingly, she also reduces their worth to men, which says quite a lot about her absorption of patriarchal and misogynistic attitudes towards women. Right after Joan confesses her feelings to Esther and Esther divulges her thoughts on lesbianism, which, as we discussed earlier, are fairly ignorant, Esther goes straight out and gets an illegal contraceptive fitted. This leads to Esther promptly losing her virginity to Erwin in an uncomfortable manner. She describes waiting to essentially be sexually aroused, but instead only experiences pain. I lay wrapped and naked on Erwin's rough blanket, waiting for the miraculous change to make itself felt. But all I felt was a sharp, startlingly bad pain. Esther ends up bleeding out, yet she smiles into the darkness whilst bleeding, stating she now feels part of a great tradition, and has, of course, lost the notion of purity that was hanging around her neck. Noticeably in this scene, there is a huge disconnection between sex and pleasure, or even that key word, tenderness. Instead of asking Erwin to take her to the hospital for the bleeding, Esther goes straight to see Joan, and Joan is the one to take her to the hospital. Esther mentions that Joan may be annoyed about Erwin's presence, but that Joan's joy at seeing her cancels out any negative feelings. His appearance a mere prick to the pleasure of my arrival. So Esther is very much aware of Joan's feelings for her whilst all of this is going on, and she withholds from Joan both the reason that she is bleeding so much and her true relation to Erwin. Notably, at the hospital, Joan actually holds Esther's hand. Joan stood, rigid as a soldier at my side, holding my hand, for my sake or hers, I couldn't tell. Esther is aware of this suggested intimacy here. She has, to an extent, put herself in Joan's care. Of course, right after this incident, Joan goes missing, and a nurse comes to ask Esther where she is. Esther gets a little defensive here and says she immediately wants to disassociate herself with Joan, which, reading between the lines, suggests that she wants to disassociate herself from Joan's lesbianism. Directly afterwards, Esther then has a haunting image of Joan's floating head. She thinks she hears her voice before falling asleep. When she is next woken up, she hears the news that Joan has hung herself. If we compare the relationship Esther has with Erwin to that which she has with Joan, it's notably different. Her relationship with Erwin was sexual yet devoid of any intimacy, and the last interaction Esther has with Erwin is incredibly icy. She tells him he can never see her again and states that his voice on the phone meant nothing to her. Looking at the relationship she has with Joan, it's almost polarized in both regards. It's non-sexual, yet she feels interlinked with her. It's likely not a coincidence that these two relationships happen side by side in the novel. Lastly, and most significantly in this novel, Esther is invited to Joan's funeral, and at this funeral she tells the reader, "And all through the simple funeral service, I wondered what I thought I was burying." This line is presented almost as a question. By burying Joan, what exactly is she burying? Her suicidal urges or her lesbianism? Or by extension, herself? Now, keep this line in mind because we will be returning to it in the next section. I have seen people speculate that Joan was a figment of Esther's imagination and was created to highlight a version of what Esther could have been without recovery. And I use that term loosely in relation to mental health. Mental health is about management, not recovery. But anyway, this doesn't fit with the narrative of being physically taken to the hospital by Joan, among various other things that happen in the book. People also conveniently leave out the lesbianism when talking about this theory of Joan being made up, which is related to lesbian erasure. Also, Esther wasn't suffering from hallucinations or delusions in the novel. Her poor mental health was related to severe depression. Whilst it's likely Esther's relationship with Joan was crafted by Plath as a metaphor or as means of self-expression, it's unlikely that Joan wasn't actually a physical entity in the novel, which leads me on to the next part of this video. This is now where we go down a bit of a rabbit hole and outside influences come into play over the deconstruction of the lesbianism in the bell jar. It's well known that the bell jar is semi-autobiographical, meaning the novel contains characters based on real people that Plath knew, with only their names changed. The character of Joan Gilling is allegedly based on a woman named Dr. Jane Anderson, a Harvard psychiatrist who won $150,000 in a lawsuit claiming that the TV version of the novel The Bell Jar falsely depicted her as a lesbian. The settlement was reached with 14 defendants in an agreement approved by US District Judge Robert Keaton, ending a week-long trial in the $6 million suit. Anderson and Plath had spent time together in a mental institution in the early 1950s when they were students at Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts. Anderson, who charged the defendants with invasion of privacy, defamation of character, and intentional infliction of emotional harm, contended her friendship with Plath was accurately portrayed in the book, but not the movie. Anderson says, "In real life, I never in any way attempted to seduce Sylvia Plath into a homosexual relationship, and I never in any way attempted to get her to enter into a suicide pact as lovers." Anderson's case is interesting for a few reasons. She alleges the character of Joan was based upon her, and she provides a fair amount of evidence to back up her claim. Notably, Anderson is also a psychiatrist, and in the novel, Joan tells Esther that she wants to be a psychiatrist. So there's a fair amount of things which track. However, the point is, if Joan is truly based on Anderson, it's significant that she was A, still alive after the novel's publication, and B, denies the lesbian aspect of the character, because this suggests that Plath used Anderson as a basis for Joan, but possibly applied the lesbianism and definitely the suicide to the character as a deliberate artistic choice. This is significant because it means Plath was exploring and then burying lesbianism in the novel, and it's likely there was a personal motivation to do so. And it is here we refer back to what Esther says, "I wondered what I thought I was burying." Of course, it's also perfectly possible that Anderson could have been a lesbian or had lesbian tendencies, but didn't want that shared with the public, for obvious reasons considering the time period. And it's also possible she took the Plath estate to court for financial gain. She won a significant amount of money in this case, and that can be a powerful motivating factor in potentially hiding lesbianism. However, this is all purely speculation, and no one really knows the truth except Anderson and Plath. Still, there's enough evidence to, at the very least, support that Joan's suicide was a deliberate artistic choice. The lesbianism, however, still has a question mark hanging above it. And this is why researching lesbian history is so difficult. There are a lot of motivating factors to hide lesbianism, and so women often do. So as you can see, there is a lot to take into consideration when discussing the lesbianism in the bell jar. The relationship between Esther and Joan is especially layered and complex, which is why there's so many different interpretations of it. I don't think it's clear-cut from any angle because the multitude of emotions that Esther has for Joan often contradict each other. Esther is repulsed by Joan and yet describes her as her beaming double. She loses her virginity to a man she doesn't even know directly after Joan expresses feelings for her, and then she goes to see Joan directly afterwards so she can be taken to the hospital, all the while refusing to tell Joan what had really happened. And ultimately, Esther's recovery is timed directly after Joan's suicide. I have to admit, whilst this relationship is clearly significant, even I don't fully understand the implications of it. The best I can make of it is that Esther had conflicting feelings and a lot of ignorance towards homosexuality as a result of absorbing and internalizing negative societal attitudes towards homosexuality in that time. You know, back then there really wasn't much to kind of combat the prejudice or the misinformation or the negative press. And this, combined with compulsory heterosexuality, had an overwhelming influence on not only the way that she related to Joan, but the way that she related to her own sexuality. You know, Joan got under Esther's skin for reasons we can only really speculate at, and even though Esther claims repulsion towards Joan, she also claims that she treasures her and sees her as almost this kind of reflection of herself. This is incredibly layered, and I think it's safe to say that Esther's relationship with Joan was possibly the most significant relationship in this entire novel. In terms of Esther's sexuality, despite her pursuit of men, I don't interpret her as strictly heterosexual, and this has less to do with her relationship with Joan and more to do with her approach and her attitude towards men. There is such a stark lack of intimacy and desire towards men in this novel, but I think it's fair to say that some of her attitude towards heteronormative sex and marriage could be a result of the warped attitudes surrounding female sexuality in 1950s American society, especially combined with a lack of sex education. Personally, it does feel like it runs a little bit deeper than that, but for sure that has to be taken into consideration here. It's also possible that Esther wasn't attracted to anybody at all. Again, it's a very layered subject. On the whole, I think if Esther was a creation in today's world, she would have a more healthy and enlightened view towards her own sexuality. But she was created in a time where the sexual landscape for women was incredibly limited and unhealthy. And this is one of the things that the bell jar portrays incredibly well. Lastly, the bell jar is semi-autobiographical, and it's well documented how a lot of Plath's work mirrors and stems from her own life experiences and her own feelings. So it's fair to say that the bell jar does raise some questions about Plath's own sexuality. As I've discussed, there is significance in setting up a lesbian character in your novel as your protagonist's double and then burying that character. All the more so if the lesbianism was a deliberate artistic choice as opposed to just based upon a lesbian that Plath knew in her real life. Certainly, it is perfectly possible that Plath buried any potential lesbianism within herself in order to survive in a society which she already felt disconnected from. And it could be that the bell jar was her way of letting us know that without having to explicitly say it. Okay guys, thanks for watching. If you've read The Bell Jar, please let me know your thoughts on this subject. Don't forget to subscribe for instant disappointment, and I'll see you guys soon. Bye!